closely from the Army Headquarters, Colombo, and Army War College, Buttala. Furthermore, the entire symposium will be live streamed on YouTube and connected to all security force headquarters and divisions via Zoom technology. As the Commandant, I am confident that this symposium will contribute to the professional development and confidence building for future military leaders. A panel of session chairs and guest speakers is poised to share knowledge with participants aligning with the symposium objectives. I acknowledge the intellectual support provided by Kotalagara Defense University and extend gratitude to the former Chief Instructor of the Army War College for laying the groundwork for today's symposium. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, it is now my distinct honor to invite the Commander, Security Force West, to deliver his opening remarks for the Army War College Symposium 2023. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Dinesh, for introducing me to this esteemed forum. It is indeed a privilege to participate in the second symposium of the redesignated Army War College, having witnessed its transformation from the Officer Career Development Center. Despite his extremely busy schedule, the Commander of the Army, Lieutenant General HLVM Liyanage, RWP, RSP, NDU, Commander of the Army, had been invited to deliver the opening remarks of the Army War College Symposium 2023. However, due to unavoidable circumstances, he is unable to attend this event. Therefore, on behalf of him, let me deliver the opening remarks of the symposium conducted under the theme of Influence of Fifth Generation Warfare and Challenges for Military in Sri Lankan Context. Let me also congratulate the Commandant and the staff of the Army War College that undertook the challenge of organizing this exceptionally professional intellectual investment. Therefore, I appreciate the initiatives taken by them in organizing this seminar as a hybrid meeting, facilitating the participants to attend the seminar either in person or virtually via the Zoom meeting platform, so as to broaden the knowledge and the professionalism of the Army despite prevailing challenging circumstances. The OCDC, which started on 23rd January 2012, was entrusted with the responsibility of conducting courses for the career progression of officers. With the post-war developments of the Army on 17 December 2021, the OCDC was upgraded to a fully fledged Army War College. So the Army War College is renowned as a world-class knowledge hub that focuses on the career progression or the officers of the Sri Lanka Army, thus facilitating a way forward for the professional capacity building of the officers and exchanging knowledge with the contemporary armies of the world. In addition to conducting formal training courses, Army War College is equally set on studying contemporary strategic concerns aiming at enhancing the military professionalism of middle grade and senior officers in order to support their career progression. So I believe that the well-run sessions of a symposium of this nature can often lead to scholarly discussions even outside the conference. We have participants joining today from locations all over the country. Before I get started, I would like to take a moment to share my appreciation for everyone enthusiastically sharing their thoughts and opine at the symposium. We understand now how difficult it was to coordinate this meeting so all major stakeholders could attend physically or virtually. I reckon that you all will make it worthwhile and meaningful. On the other hand, it is good to see that the resource persons from both military and civil sectors, including the keynote speaker, as well as session chairs and guest speakers, are waiting to contribute in order to achieve the set objectives quite positively. Therefore, all the participants, discussions, and speakers are all set of harness the domains of intellectual capacities during all 5 sessions of this innovative discussion conducted in the form of a hybrid meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, the session 1 is symposium is on 5th generation warfare and challenges for state. During session 2, it is expected to share information based on the subtopic critical technologies and its impact. In session 3, the information based on the subtopic will be military strategies in support of formulation of military guidance policy making. Session 4 will be based on the subtopic leadership and decision making in complex operational environment. While during session 5, you will share information based on the subtopic way forward for the Sri Lanka military. In conclusion, I must say that in Sri Lanka, the military has always maintained a professional approach and successfully fulfilled the fundamental demands that the state expects. That is operational competence and sound advice. In turn, the government has supported the military by ways of policy formulation, oversight and allocation of resources to maintain military readiness. I have no doubt that the officers taking part physically from the Army War College itself or joining via Zoom platform, mostly battalion commanders, will gather the necessary information on the subject. Ladies and gentlemen, I am certain that they will stimulate their mental faculties to greater depths academically as well as intellectually, that you would see this platform to put forward your own thoughts and arguments and fairly discuss the subject matter in length in order to derive the best.
Sir, thank you very much for the insightful opening remarks and enhancing the enthusiasm of everyone who is present today. We are very much grateful and please accept our sincere gratitude for being present here with us.
Now, I would like to invite Lieutenant Colonel DPASA Vitarana PSC, Sri Lanka Armed Corps, a member of the directing staff of Army War College, to introduce the keynote speaker of the symposium.
Respected keynote speaker, the chief guest, principal staff officers, the Commandant Army War College, directors, senior officers, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a very good morning. We have the privilege of being in this audience of Army War College Symposium 2023, and we are at the outset to harness the intellectual domains on a timely subject. Therefore, I believe many inspirited initiatives that our series impact on our subject matter create a world phenomena, because the fifth generation warfare is basically a war of information and perception. To commence this symposium with an intellectual fascinating upright and to focus on the strategies of formulating military guidance as core concept under set themes, we are pleased to have an experienced panelist and a speaker in many forums of this nature. Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to witness a groundbreaking approach to tackle the future challenges for the military in Sri Lankan context. In terms of the influences of fifth generation warfare with keynote speech today. Keynote speech will be delivered by a scholar on the subject and a present director of Center for Law and Warfare, Mr. Lanka, whose writing now concern diverse focuses on hybrid warfare, maritime piracy, human streams, space warfare, military technology, and urban insurgency for the publications of John Hopkins, a Journal of International Affairs, and the Columbia Journal of International Affairs. Further, he is a regular commentator on the televisions and radio on security matters, having appeared on the international platforms like World is One News, popularly known as WN, and Al Jazeera. Mr. Nilantan is a regular visiting lecturer in higher seats of military and defense studies such as National Defense College, Army War College Buttala, and Defense Services Command and Staff College Batalamda. Mr. Nilanta Nirutan is a proud graduate of University of Hull, United Kingdom in year 2007 with Bachelor of Laws, and he obtained his Masters from the National Law Schools of India in year 2010 in the fields of international human rights. He is a current reading for his PhD at the Faculty of Graduate Studies in University of Colombo. Ladies and gentlemen, with his expertise knowledge, I am certain that we would be able to embark into a highly informative keynote speech. Without further ado, let me now have the honor of inviting Mr. Nilanka Nirutan to commence his proceeding. Sir, over to you. This one, sir.
Thank you. I just need to put my stopwatch to make sure that I don't speak for too long. First of all, good morning to the chief guest, Commandant, to all the distinguished officers here. I think many of you are have been my students at some point of time in the past, so there are lots of familiar faces here. I would first of all like to start off by congratulating the Commandant and the organizing team for their understanding of fifth generation warfare. And what I mean by that is, when we look at the topics that are going to be discussed over the course of the next 2 days, and when we look at the different types of discussions that we seem to be kind of on the verge of having over the next 2 days, the one thing that's very clear to me is that, thankfully, we have a very sharp understanding of fifth generation warfare in this country right now, and it's very heartening to see, because I've worked with military professionals and military scholars from many different countries, and my own think tank, the Center for Law and Warfare, we work with a lot of international figures in terms of very, very cutting edge issues in the development of warfare. And I can tell you that even in many supposedly advanced countries, they struggle when it comes to understanding what fifth generation warfare is, and more importantly, how it has to be analyzed and studied in a format like a symposium. So on that note, I would like us to, first of all, I guess, be very happy that the next 2 days will see a lot of actual in-depth discussion into fifth generation warfare, as things should be. So let's firstly, I'm not going to go into the basics of what is fifth generation warfare and all that. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with these terms already. But let me start with one quick analogy. So a lot of people often ask me, will World War III ever happen? Or when will there be World War III? And what I often tell them is, well, World War III is already happening. We are already, you could argue, in the midst of World War III. It's just that we don't see it because it's non-kinetic, because it's fifth generation warfare. For example, thousands of Chinese hackers attack American businesses every single day. Thousands of American hackers attack Chinese businesses every single day. But because this is not kinetic, because it's not physical in the real world, many of us don't even realize that it's going on. But the infrastructure damage, the economic damage, the political damage that is perpetrated by these hackers on the other country is quite comparable to what we would see if there was an actual physical war. So other than the element of physical destruction, we are seeing the leading powers in the world attacking each other. It just so happens to be in a non-physical domain, and therefore many people don't even realize that is going on. And the reason I bring this up as my first point is because this is very fundamental to understanding the nature of the world that we are living in. That we could actually be living through a war without realizing that we are living through a war. That we could actually all be on the front lines of a battle without realizing that we are on the front lines of a battle, right? And that's the key characteristic, I would say, of fifth generation warfare. You will often find many scholars use the term omnipresent battlefield. What that means is everything is a battlefield now. There's no such thing as one area is a peace zone and one area is a war zone. There's no such thing as, okay, these are the people on the front lines and we are all behind them, safe and sound. That doesn't happen anymore. That does not apply to today's strategic or security situation anymore. Now, the term itself, as many of you know, was first coined by William Lind in 1989. He came up with the idea of splitting the history of warfare into different generations. So he said the ancient warfare idea of a melee battle where you would clash with swords and spears and shields, that was the first generation of warfare. And then you had a slightly more mechanized version of warfare that started coming up in World War I. So you had the trenches, you had the proper kind of what I guess we would call entrenchment tactics, and on the heels of the Industrial Revolution as well, it became impossible for people to just fight in melee combat. The element of firepower really changed the way that World War I was fought. And he said this was the second generation. When we then came to World War II, we saw that the mechanization of warfare had increased even more. So you had these, you no longer had just line and column tactics with firepower. You now had proper movement tactics and things like the blitzkrieg tactics used by the Germans in World War II. So he says this further form of mechanization was the third generation of warfare. So to recap, when we fought with sticks and swords and spears and shields, that was the first generation. When firepower and entrenchment were introduced, that became the second generation. When our military vehicles like tanks and planes and all that were mechanized even further, and the maneuverability and the speed became the most important things, that became the third generation. And William Lind in 1989 wrote that the world was currently entering a fourth generation. William Lind never spoke about fifth generation, that came much later. But in 1989, when this whole concept of, when this whole idea of looking at warfare as generations was introduced, he said, look, we are now entering a fourth generation of warfare, because we are now seeing non-state actors play a far more heavy active role in warfare than the state actors. And this is something that many military scholars and nations had not considered before, because even though non-state actors have always been a very heavy part of warfare, I mean, you could go back thousands of years and you will see that there's tribal warfare, there were dacoits, there were terrorists, there were rebels, insurgents. Throughout the course of history, it's not like the 20th century was the first century to see these things. But the 20th century had a very distinct idea of warfare, of what warfare was, because of World War I and World War II. And when these knew, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, as we returned to the age of terrorism, to the age of non-state actors and things like that, many people said, oh wow, this is now the fourth generation. So until then, until that point, there was no real controversy in terms of how we ought to understand warfare. This term fifth generation warfare is where most of the controversy starts, because, I mean, as acknowledged in the document for the symposium very rightly, one of the hallmarks of fifth generation warfare is that it is more or less impossible to define. So that's one of the major challenges that we have. We know that something like this exists. When we see it, we know that we can identify it as fifth generation warfare. But if someone was to ask us to sit down and come up with a clear and concise definition for what it is, none of us would have a real answer, because there is no real answer. But there are some key characteristics of fifth generation warfare that we can all keep in mind, and hopefully throughout the sessions in the next 2 days, the speakers will kind of touch on these issues as well. The first is that fifth generation warfare takes away the technology and tactical monopoly from the state. And what I mean by that is, when we look at many of the wars that are fought under this fifth generation paradigm, the control of information, the control of what we call narrative, that becomes far more important than physical casualties on either side. Let me just give you two contemporary examples, since it's on the news and all that. When we look at the Israel-Gaza conflict, when we look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the reality is that our perception of these wars are not based on physical casualty numbers or physical destruction figures at all. In fact, many of us might not even be getting accurate information from the front line. The winner here is decided by perception. The winner here is decided by the war on narratives. If the entire world feels that Israel is losing, then Israel is losing. If the entire world feels that Russia is losing, then Russia is indeed losing. We look at, let's say, an early example of this was the Vietnam War, and I've mentioned this to many of my students before in many different classrooms. If you ask a normal lay person on the road in most countries, hey, what do you think happened in the Vietnam War? Most of them would say, oh, the Americans got kicked out of Vietnam. The Americans could not deal with the Vietnamese peasants, and therefore they had to run away from Vietnam without any of their objectives being completed. Now, if we sit down and look at the statistics, the Americans were militarily, in terms of how many Viet Cong they were able to kill, far more successful than the Vietnamese. It's something like, for every American soldier that the Viet Cong killed, something like 80 or 90 Viet Cong were killed by the Americans. Right? So the Americans killed 80 or 90 times as many insurgents as the insurgents were able to kill American soldiers. And yet, because the narrative is that the Americans got beaten up and they had to run away, history remembers the Americans almost as having lost the Vietnam War. So all their military successes on the battlefield were more or less useless because they were not able to win the war of narrative. Let's look at our own experience, because once again, as I was saying, when I saw the different sessions that had been allocated for the next 2 days, I saw that there was one discussion on the emerging technology. There was one panel or one session we are going to have on policy making, one on decision making and leadership, then another on the Sri Lankan perception. So these are all the kind of important points that we need to hit. Sri Lanka, as many of you know, we had to face and fight through fifth generation warfare almost before any other country in the world. It was a battle of perception. It was a battle of improvised technology. It was a battle of new levels and types of tactics. Almost everything about our war against the LTTE was fifth generation in nature. You will notice that I said our war against the LTTE. Here again is another example of fifth generation warfare. Now think of the number of times all of you have heard military experts, military officers, politicians use the term civil war, ethnic war. Even people who belong to the political class and the armed forces and the media field in our country, I have noticed, keep using the term civil war and ethnic war. Now this once again is us shooting ourselves in the foot. This was not a civil war. This was not an ethnic war. It was a counter-insurgency campaign against the LTTE, and before that against a number of different separatist organizations like TELO and all that. In fact, about 2 years ago, when Admiral Jayannath Columbage was the Foreign Secretary, I met him and I emphasized this point to him. I said, we need to make sure that we are not repeating these faulty terms over and over again, because this is shooting ourselves in the foot. If even we are calling it a civil war, if even we are calling it an ethnic war, then what do you expect our enemies to do? Our enemies are going to say yes. From their perspective, they do see this as a war between two communities. They do see this as a war between the people. Whereas we always have to be very, very clear that this was not a war against the citizens of our country. This was a counter-insurgency campaign against a separatist organization. So that's just a quick casual example of how fifth generation warfare and the war of narratives can manifest in many different forms, and how even we ourselves can sometimes be unaware of the intricacies of fifth generation warfare. Let me touch on another major complication that we have when it comes to fifth generation warfare, which is that there is no real international legal framework to deal with this new type of warfare. Once again, we can use our own country as an example, right? The term that's now being used is lawfare, as in a mix of law and warfare. Lawfare is a fifth generation tactic used by insurgent organizations and terrorist groups to attack their former enemy even after the war has been lost. So look at what the LTT or the remnants of supporters of the LTT do to us. They have lost the battle on the physical battlefield, so they have now switched the battle to the legal battlefield. So once you lose the war, you then say, oh, war crimes were committed, crimes against humanity were committed. There needs to be some kind of legal accountability. So even though you have lost the war in the actual real world, you then move it to the legal domain and you continue the war there. And you target your former enemy there. And unfortunately, the modern international legal framework is not equipped to deal with this. I mean, the last time there was a significant revision to the international laws of war was in 1977, and even that was just a minor change. Almost all of our international laws of war regulating even fifth generation warfare, by the way, is from the 40s. Now ask yourselves this: would we be okay with driving on the road with traffic laws from the 1940s? Would we be okay with getting married through marriage laws from the 1940s? Would we be okay with going to a workplace with employment and labor laws from the 1940s? The answer would be no. In almost any other field, the idea that the legal framework that's governing you is almost a century old would be completely unacceptable. And yet when it comes to warfare, when it comes to the most important facet of national security, we are still kind of subject to laws from the bygone eras of World War I and World War II, and we are then called the criminals. We are then called the quote-unquote bad guys or whatever you want to call it, because the laws are completely outdated. I mean, just look at human shields, for instance, right? Human shields are a tactic that it's always been used, but in the era of fifth generation warfare, you see human shields being used on a far greater basis. In fact, you will not be able to find a single war or conflict in the world today where human shields are not employed. You can look at the current squabbling in Sudan. You can look at the previous war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. You could look at the two examples that I just quoted, the Israel and the Russian examples. You could look at the American interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, or American invasion, however you want to phrase it. In every modern conflict, you now see insurgents using human shields. Why? Because it's a win-win situation for the insurgent. If they are not bound by any international law, they are not bound by any international duty. So I can use civilians as a shield and there's nothing that you can do about it. And if you do choose to do something about it, I can make you look like a war criminal, right? And so this is a major facet of modern fifth generation warfare, where the tactics being used by the enemies of the state are not just physical warfare based tactics, they are far more non-kinetic in nature. When we look at the different technologies and policy initiatives that come out of this or that need to come out of this, we have autonomous technology, as in missile platforms that can operate without any human intervention. I mean, everybody knows about the Iron Dome and the Iron Beam that's going to soon come out. These are completely autonomous systems. When we look at the Israel-Gaza conflict and the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we've started seeing autonomous drones being used, as in, let's say, something like the Kardu 2 drone that's manufactured by Turkey, that was used on a large scale in both by both the Russian side and the Ukrainian side. You could just fly that drone, and even if the enemy uses an electronic jammer to cut off the signal, that drone can just operate on its own. It's almost like a fire and forget system, where you send the drone into the air and you forget about it. The drone will then hunt your enemies, and it will start striking at your enemies. They move as a big group, so like a swarm of drones. You have technological developments like 3D printing. Like, how is 3D printing now going to affect the landscape of warfare, where anybody in their homes can just print out a gun and they can use that as ammunition. In Israel, I'm sure some of you might have heard about it, about 5 or 6 years ago, an Israeli journalist print and